The first thing I remember is the howl. Not a long, drawn-out thing, but a short, cracked call that rolled down from the trees like someone trying to start an old truck on a cold morning. It came at 2 in the morning, and my German shepherd went from sleeping at the foot of the bed to standing bolt upright, with his hackles up, ears pricked, and a low whine that sounded almost like the second syllable of my son's name. Then, from somewhere past the fence line, a thin voice called, soft and wrong. "Dad, Dad, he's calling my name." My hands were already on the nightstand. I didn't turn any lights on. You don't when the woods are awake in a place like ours. Light makes things move toward the danger. I slid the door open, and the cold hit the back of my throat. Late January air, silver on the grass, and a smell like wet pine and the old iron of the railroad ties. My dog bumped my knee, low and steady, like he was telling me to be careful in my body, even before my brain caught up. I stood there in my socks, listening, feeling my heart do that heavy, slow thing I get since the diagnosis. I could hear the sound of my son, the voice, clear as if he'd stepped off the porch. That's where the story starts. If you're listening to this on the feed, hang with me through the whole account. There's bonus material and clearer photos available on the site for subscribers, and I put up some of the thermal frames we took that night. Stay until the end. The whole picture matters. But please, if you ever find yourself with an unexplained animal out there, don't go alone. Tell someone, call the agency, and stay safe. We didn't do anything reckless after that first night, and that choice kept my family intact. I want to say up front who I am. I'm Ray Pritchard. I grew up on this property, a little place outside Ashdown, Arkansas, with the tracks cutting through the bottom field and a stand of mixed hardwoods that make up our back 40. I worked the land most of my life, kept dogs, fished the pond at the gun club, and I know animals. I know how a raccoon walks and how a coyote pauses when it catches scent. I don't pretend to know what we ran into, but I've measured prints, photographed eyeshine, and spoken with the local conservation officers. I've lost count of how many times my son and I argued about patience and about calling his name to get him out of trouble. So when something called his voice out of the dark, it mattered in a way that gets under you. The first night, the smallest thing, could have been a trick of sleep, a neighbor messing with us, a fox with a weird yelp. It started with the dog. He woke me by scratching at the bedroom door and whining, the way he'd done the summer before when a firework went off. I opened the door and the kitchen clock read 2:06. Outside, the world was a flat black with a pale smear where the moon held, and the trees were motionless, like someone had pressed pause on them. Then the sound. A short howl, not the long, mournful kind, more like a human trying to imitate a dog, but getting the timing wrong. After that, as if sliding out of the same breath, the voice that made my stomach go cold. Daddy. Soft and crooked, like my boy when he was 3 and afraid of thunder. I froze. The dog barked once, hard. My fiancée, Melissa, stirred in the next room. I called, "Jake?" quietly, the way you test the air for a stray branch. I walked to the back door and looked out toward the fence line where the ditch drops toward the tracks. The path lights at the far end of the yard were off. For a long minute I saw nothing but the empty gate and the red blaze of the distant crossing. There was nothing more that night, just the echo of the sound folding into the trees. I checked the back porch, walked the yard with a flashlight and my .30-08 on my shoulder. I don't like to sleep with a gun in my hand if I can help it, but I bring one to bed sometimes, since I had the diagnosis. It calms me to have a tool I know. I walked the perimeter slow, scanning with a flashlight and a Gen 2 monocular I'd borrowed from the neighbor. I found 3 prints in the mud at the edge of the gravel, too big for a dog, longer than a wolf print, at least 12–14 inches long if you lay your boots side by side. The pads were not splayed like a bear. They were narrow, almost like something had 4 toes and a long pad behind. They were fresh, the edges soft and pressed deep from the saturated thaw. I took pictures with my phone and a cheap digital camera. I marked the spot with flagging tape and went back inside. Jake slept through it all. The next morning, I told him only that we'd had some activity, because alarms make boys want to go see. He was 17 then, getting ready for the Marine recruiters with that stubborn jaw his mother says I gave him. He laughed when I showed him the photos, maybe an uncomfortable laugh, the kind that covers up the curiosity. He called it a coyote. I called it a footprint the size of my hand and half again. He didn't come out to measure. He was going to be a Marine. He'd argue discipline instead of patience. That first week, we did what people in the country do when they find something puzzling. We watched. We set out trail cameras. We talked to the neighbors. Linda, down on County Road 4, she runs a small motel and knows more about night critters than anyone I know. She said animal eyes can look red depending on the bank and angle of light. She told me to get good photos before I made it an issue. John, the neighbor 2 properties over, who hunts coons and works the timber, came over with a rangefinder and a flashlight and measured the distance from the gate to the tracks. He said the prints made a path that crossed where the ditch dips and goes toward the tracks, like a shortcut. We put up 2 cameras at first, cheap passive infrared models. One didn't trigger at night, and the other caught a split frame of something moving past at 3:17 a.m. Just a shadowed vertical form, a mass between the trunks, leaving a wider shape than a coyote. The timestamps matched the whistles we'd heard. Nobody got excited. People collect weird photos all the time. We filed it in the weird but explainable box. It built from there. The calls came more often, always at night and always timed around the small hours when the world goes quiet. When the dogs picked up the scent and the woods went silent, the sound would come. Short howls, then that voice, never more than the one word, and always the name. Once it said Jake twice, the first time high and boyish, the second time with the rasp and breath of something taller. The dog would stare into the trees, lips lifted, jaw tensed, like he was listening to someone behind the bark. Melissa stopped sleeping in the bedroom for a month. We put the alarm on at night and left the porch light on longer than normal. By the 2nd month, the prints were regular. I started carrying a tape, measuring stride and length, noting toe impressions and claw marks. The tracks showed a long stride, often 5 to 6 feet between impressions, depending on how soft the ground was. The pads left elongated impressions, and occasionally there were deep centrifugal scrapes, as if the creature pushed off with a long plantigrade foot. I compared them to reference prints in my old hunting manuals, and to prints John had taken when he tripped over a large bobcat last winter. They didn't match anything standard. Elk prints are cloven. Bears leave a broad heel. This felt like something between a wolf and a man, which is a stupid thing to say and worse to write down at the county office, but it's what the prints suggested. We called the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. The officer who came out, a man named Carter, listened more than he talked. He walked the line with his boots sinking to the top of my ankle in the gutter where the soil holds water. He took pictures, filed a report, and collected a plaster cast of the deepest print. He didn't write me off. He said there are oddities in the woods, big cats, feral hogs, sometimes things that people with time on their hands mislabel. He also said he had other reports from the county of anomalous sightings. That made him cautious, but not credulous. He said to keep cameras up and to call if something escalated. He offered to swing by with a trapper from the nearest district if it looked like an animal in distress. But he also said, carefully, that traps and leg-hold devices do more harm than good in these situations, and they create legal trouble. He emphasized not to take matters into my own hands. That advice is the kind that saves marriages, and sometimes lives. I didn't like receiving it. There were nights I wanted to paint the back field with spotlights and station myself with a rifle. I won't hide that thought.
It moved high, across branches, or it shifted behind the trunks so quickly that the light couldn't find a solid shape for more than a second. Jake swore, sharp and brief, the kind of expletive that resonates when people drop the masks and try to name what they see. He had that one-stepped-back look I'd seen in photos of men returning from combat. Eyes cold, jaw set, body ready for direction. He asked me if I had my gun. I told him yes. He didn't pull his. He sagged into a decision he hadn't thought he'd be forced to make. Melissa screamed then, quiet and thin, from farther in the house, and the noise made everyone flinch. I told her to go inside. I told Jake to stay with the door. We didn't move toward the trees. We called the conservation officer and told him we had something that imitated voices, and he took it down with that pencil-cup tone of a professional. He didn't laugh. He told us to record anything that happened and to avoid getting out there in the dark. He said, "That's the only thing I can tell you that will probably matter. Don't go hunting shadows. I want to see evidence. If it's something causing harm, we'll move." He suggested we put up a motion-activated flood at the porch, angle it at the tree line, and leave 2 cameras. He drove by that night and stayed in his car at the end of the lane to watch, lights off, radio tuned to the scanner. That night, the cameras caught sound and eyeshine and one frame where something stood upright in the ditch at an angle that implied 2 legs beneath a long torso. It wasn't a clear photo. It doesn't stand up on its own. But the thermal overlay we managed to salvage for subscribers shows a higher mass than you'd expect for a coyote, and a heat signature that flows where a human neck and shoulders would be. It left us with the stomach-sick sense that whoever or whatever it was could adopt positions that confused our taxonomy. After that night, the family tried to normalize. Jake went back to his training. Melissa started sleeping with the TV on a little louder. I learned to wake up to silence and not panic. We set up routines, check-ins over the phone, lights on timers, the dog sleeping by the bedroom door. The children decreased their late-night walks, and my granddaughter stopped visiting for sleepovers for a while. What kept me up was less the idea of being attacked and more the idea of something learning our syllables. My mind kept going back to that phonetic edge, how the creature used the cadence of our speech rather than the words themselves. It didn't perfectly mimic, it approximated. It used sound as a tool. We began a careful civilian-style investigation. Not traps, not lures. Cameras, thermal imagers, documenting prints, and checking the radio scanner for anyone else on the line. I reached out quietly to someone who wrote about anomalous canines in the region, an author named Linda who had a book on the shelf at the county library.
She came out a week later, not the type to be impressed easily, and she walked the line with the same steady, methodical step game wardens have. She pointed out how the tracks favored the underbrush where the soil gave, how sometimes the pattern suggested a creature that could stand occasionally and move with a long, loping gait. She didn't give me answers. She gave me a vocabulary for describing what we saw. We began to catalog the encounters as if they were specimens in a ledger. Date, time, notes. 1-22, 2:06 a.m., short howl. Male voice approximated daddy. Prince, 14 long. Stride, approx 5 feet. Thermal frame, elongated mass. Camera B failed to trigger. That kind of bookkeeping kept the night from becoming a fever. It gave us something to do besides panic. Not all the incidents were as dramatic as the night Jake was home. Mostly there were sounds and eyeshine and prints. Once in February, when the ground was hard and the frost had formed delicate crystals on the fence posts, I found a set of marks leading down to the river that looked like someone had tried to drag something heavy for 2 paces and then stopped. The drag marks were shallow, as if whatever was dragged was smooth and cylindrical. And then there were footprints again, leading back up. I thought of an animal carrying prey. I thought of a deer. I thought of a joke friend that told me the dogs were playing with a log. I thought a lot of foolish things at the time. When you spend nights alone on the porch counting, your imagination will dress up in whatever coat it pleases. By March, the voice phenomenon escalated in a way I wasn't comfortable with. Jake would call on the phone from base and tell me about his days. Sometimes he'd prank me by imitating the voice around here. He has a pull within a pull laugh that lifts his jaw when he does it, and we would trade shots about who could do the better voice. When he was off the phone, the call would sometimes come from the yard. "Dad, Dad, he's calling my name." It was never the full conversation, never anything coherent. It was a lure that used the pattern of our lives to get attention. One night stood out because it made me change the rules. Melissa and I heard the sound at 1:48 a.m. The dog padded onto the bed and laid a heavy muzzle on my shoulder. "Dad," came that voice, my son's tone clipped into 2 parts. This time, there was response from a second place in the trees. An answering howl, low and toothy, an intelligence behind it. Then came a rustle on the roofline. At first I thought a branch, then I realized it was movement, a long, heavy body moving across some high limb, scraping the metal of the old satellite dish as it passed. We didn't have a ladder tall enough to check, and I thought about calling a contractor. I thought about grabbing my rifle and shining a light up to see. The image of taking a shot and hitting some neighbor's line, or being wrong and grieving for no reason, sat heavy in my head. And I knew John had been right before. The most dangerous thing you do in these situations is assume you know enough to act alone. Instead, I phoned conservation again, and this time we had 2 officers, one from down in Texarkana and Carter from our district. They parked down the lane again, lights off, and set up a pole-mounted floodlight angled at the trunks and an audio recorder at the gate. The recorder caught something the cameras didn't, a lower register than a dog, with little clicks and a breath that sounded almost human, layered under what mimicked the name. When the officers played it back on a tablet, both of them frowned in that way men do when the world gives them a problem that belongs to a different rule book. "Could be a person playing games," Carter said, but he didn't sound convinced. The other officer said, If it is, they know how to make their voice carry through the pines. If it's not, then we should beef up recording and wait for a clearer frame. He advised we put out more cameras along the ditch, aim one at the high limbs and one at ground level, and to keep a log of times. He left us with the same word of caution: do not set out to meet it alone. If it escalates into violence, call in. We did as he advised. We didn't sleep much. The cameras returned frames with two-headed eyes, with silhouettes that seemed to be two animals moving together, with nothing at all. Once a camera picked up a crossbarred reflection, a pale flank that could have been a deer if placed differently. We started to interpret the absence as data. On nights when the wind came from the southwest, we'd have more recorded activity. On nights when the winds were still, the sound moved like it had a purpose. We used a compass and a cheap weather meter to track direction and set up the cameras accordingly. It was comforting to have charts. All this cautious method didn't resolve the human problem. The thing calling the name wasn't just an oddity. It began to affect the way my family moved through air. My granddaughter would not go out back to the swing set without someone older. Melissa took to sleeping with the light on in the hallway. My daughter called and told me to fence in the dog more secure. People who once accepted a laugh about old Dogman on the tracks at the diner grew quiet when we told them we had something that said Jake's name. The social friction wasn't dramatic. It was 1,000 small changes. No more porch hangs, no more late grilling at the picnic table, someone else bringing the mail if it came after sundown. A week in April, the worst thing that could have happened to us as a family almost did. I say almost because the hard choices we had made, not to hunt alone, to wait, to call in help.
Era ao, to hunt alone, to wait, to call in help, held. I was outside that night, standing by the truck with a thermoscope and a wool blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the trees light up like a black skyline on the monitor. Jake was home again. He had a rotation and came off base for a weekend. He insisted on walking the fence line with me, shoulder to shoulder, the kind of silent company that doesn't demand conversation. We had one of the better setups that weekend: 2 thermal units, a stationary camera with a wide-angle lens on a pole, and a motion-activated video cam near the ditch. Around midnight, the monitor blinked. 2 white shapes moving together through the understory, then one rising into something that looked almost anthropoid and lifting its face toward the farm lights. Something like a hiss went through a speaker, and then the name. Jake, it said in a thin pull. The hair on my arms rose. My dog threw himself against his chain and barked, furious and helpless. I don't know what overcame me. Maybe it was the way the voice carried the exact cadence of my son's laugh. Maybe it was the picture on the screen, the white heat outline of something standing upright in the ditch in the frame that suggested shoulders and neck. Maybe it was the accumulated fear of months. I had my 308. It was leaning against my leg, rested against my shoulder from the cold. I felt the old reflexive surge: aim, breathe, squeeze. Jake saw it and put his hand on my forearm, steady and somehow small against my shaking. He said, not in a whisper, but not in a shout, "Dad, don't." He sounded like the man he'd learned to be, measured, calm, willing to defer to better sense. He wasn't a kid pleading to be saved. He was a soldier rerouting a man from acting on an anger that could end badly. We call them in, he said. We get someone with a plan that doesn't put us in the wrong.
That was the moment when the moral climax crested, not an explosion or a shot fired, but the choice to stand down. If I'd fired, we'd have been men taking a life in a way that couldn't be undone. If I'd missed, we might have provoked a desperate animal into an attack. If I'd hit something, we might have killed a protected species or been wrong in a way my family couldn't survive. Jake's presence that night, his hand, his calm, forced me to be the practical father I wanted to be. Someone who chooses later days with family over immediate satisfaction. We recorded everything we could and waited until the officers came. They took more measurements. They broadened their search area. They cross-referenced our timestamps with other calls into their office. They couldn't tell us what it was, and neither could Linda when she checked some of our prints against ones she'd cataloged from other states. The consensus was an oddity, something the documentation world didn't have a box for. They emphasized restraint and safety. They told us to get more footage and to keep people safe. We did. We complied.
We shifted our life a degree inward, not dramatized or fearful, but cautious. There are days I wish we'd walked out and met it on its terms. But then I see Jake on a video calling his 2-year-old niece and swinging her around with his marine laugh, and I know I made the right choice. That's not where the story stops. The voice phenomenon didn't disappear. In late May, during a spring thaw with mosquitoes and the smell of fresh-turned soil, a camera at the gate caught something that made me sleep with the light on for 2 weeks. It showed a close shot of eye shine at the edge of the frame and a momentary facial outline with what looked like a muzzle, and, beside it, a whisper of a mouth that shaped letters like Dad in the freeze frame. The picture looks like noise if you show it to someone used to clean scientific frames. To us, it was proof that whoever it was had learned how to play the parts of our family. I still teach that to my friends when they look at the photos. You can see the effort to imitate. You can see the mismatch. It's not perfect. It has gaps where breath and wind and fur change the puzzle. But it left us with the understanding that whatever it is, it can and will use elements of our lives to get our attention. That alone is unnerving enough. We kept a ledger. We kept the cameras. We kept our check-ins. I joined the local small group that now meets for coffee in daylight and swapped stories with other men who had nights they didn't want to repeat. I learned not to let my fear turn to planning violence. The way the best men in my life talked about it, John, the officers, even Linda, they always came back to the same point. Prove the fact before you assume cause, and keep your family safe, because nothing you do alone in the dark will heal you if it costs them what matters. There were small consolations. The dog grew used to the sounds and matched them with the bell at the gate. If something lingered at the fence, he would go out and mark, and we would know. The cameras occasionally caught a shape that suggested a heavy bipedal silhouette. Once, in July, a frame recorded 2 sets of tracks crossing like a person walking with a very large canine. And for a bewildering second, I felt the old human impulse to narrate it as they were together. That's dangerous fancifulness, and I wrote it in the ledger with a note to myself: don't anthropomorphize, seek corroboration. I told this to the men and women who came to me with curiosity and wanted the drama. My answer to them has always been the same. I know what I heard. I know what I saw. I know how it changed my family. I don't know what it is. I know its voice and its prince, and that it can do things I haven't given it credit for. There are nights I look at the tree line and imagine explanations from misidentified deer to some learned behavior of coyotes to something else entirely. The more I learn, the less I'm sure of the categories we use to describe the wild.
A few nuances I want to be clear about. When I say it imitated Jake's voice, I don't mean a perfect reproduction. The cadence was right. The breath and rasp, the tiny inflections the boy carried as a child, those got pulled into a sound that was recognizably ours. It used the rhythms of our life like a key. And when you are a father who has taught a child to come home at the call of the name, that knowledge is a vulnerability. We started to prioritize routine and presence. Jake called more often. Melissa refused to go to the mailbox at night. I learned to be content with daylight chores and to let the dark alone. That restraint is the truest defense I can offer anyone who asks what to do. The officers advised it. The man with cancer in his chest insists upon it, because I want to keep my people whole for as long as I have them. There are days I am practical, and days the wonder and the fear sit at the same table. I will admit the temptation to curiosity is strong. I will admit the urge to face a thing to test whether it is material or dream. But if there's one thing this place has taught me, beyond prints and thermal frames and the way the wind sounds when a thing is moving in the high limbs, it's that some doors don't need to be opened by you. Some puzzles are for patient hands and wider nets. You don't win by being the first one to pull the curtain aside. We kept a last line of defense. We documented, we avoided rash action, and we stayed together. That choice has been the through line of this story. It led us away from a night that could have been our last big mistake, and toward months of living in a house that knows its own shadows. There's more to tell. There are other nights, and another camera angle that showed something walking upright along the embankment like a man too tall for the ditch. There's the time a neighbor's child called a school talk about the animal on the tracks, and how that rippled into the county fair conversations. There are small reconciliations, like when my granddaughter held my hand on the porch swing and measured the distance between the yard light and the trees, naming the steps she was allowed to take at night. There are the lines of prints that turn at an odd angle and make you think of purpose rather than chance. But what I want you to hold before we go forward is this. What we saw and heard forced a set of decisions that changed the shape of our lives. They were not decisions of bravado or of vengeance. They were decisions to guard, to document, and to prioritize the future of the family over the satisfaction of a single night. I tell you that because people will hear this and think of heroics. I tell you that because the better heroic act most nights is not to do the dramatic thing, but to live to tell the tale. There's an image I come back to. The dog at the back door, fur vibrating with the sound of the wood, and the voice calling my son's name as if testing that the world is the one we've known. That line keeps winding through my sleep. I am older than I was when the cries began. I have a health sheet that tells me to be careful. I have a boy who can handle himself and a family who has learned caution the hard way. We keep the cameras and we listen. We let the professionals do the things we should not. We also did something else. We planted a camera where the most recent tracks crossed the fence. A high-definition model that would catch face-level shots if something ever moved close enough. We left it armed one night into the blue of August, and that footage,
Well, that footage is when things stopped being comfortable. It captured a pause at the fence that lasted almost a full minute, and a sound that wasn't just calling a name. It was the first time we had a recording of a low, almost syllabic chitter layered under a voice that tried to match our laughter. I will go over those frames and the night's audio in detail, with dates and timestamps and the officer's notes. I'll show you the ledger entries and how they changed before and after that recording. I'll show you what we did with the evidence and why we made the safety calls we did. But for now, remember the core. It imitated a child. It knew what to use in order to pull at a father's instincts. That is the practical danger of this thing. It's not in a roar or a maul. It's in the small sounds it uses to startle us awake. I'll pick up from the August recording and go through what happened after, how the county responded, how the family adjusted, and what I did when the sound on the tape made even the officers' faces go tight. I will also show the prints we measured in July, and the ledger entry that says, plainly, avoid confrontation. When we come back to that night, you'll see why we changed a lot of our plans, and why, despite all the curiosity around us, we still recommend caution and reporting over heroics. For those who want to follow the technical stuff, I have posted the timestamps and the thermal frames online. For those who care about the family story, know that the decision to keep our heads down and our doors locked saved us a grief I won't go through again. I'll get into that night now and how the officers handled the footage, but the thing I don't want anyone to take from this is the idea of fame or spectacle. We didn't chase it for clicks. We kept our family. That choice will carry into the rest of this account. They set the room up like any other evidence review. Fluorescent hum, a long metal table, a monitor that swallowed light. The sheriff came in with his coat still damp from a storm. The detective with the quiet gait of someone who had been up too many nights. A young technician carried a tablet and a hard drive that smelled faintly of plastic and cold storage. I sat against the wall, my hands folded the way you fold them when you want not to be noticed, while my son stood with his back to the window as if the glass might betray him. The technician plugged in the drive, and the file list appeared. Camera, underline, 03, underline, AG, underline, 12, underline, 2312, punto MP4. He put the headphones on, checked levels, and told them where to look. Pause at 0048, he said. Zoom 2.5, freeze frame at 0052. On the monitor, the fence was a black serrated line against a yard that a house light tried and failed to keep honest. For almost a minute, a shadow halted there, upright and still enough that for a while it might have been a person standing with a coat pulled tight. Then the shadow shifted, turned its head just enough to interrupt the geometry of the fence, and the audio, God, the audio folded into the room. First came the laughter. Someone, something, imitated laughter, the way a radio, badly tuned to a distant station, imitates music. It sounded like the laugh of a child we'd all heard on 100 porches. An edge of breath, a quick rise and fall. Then, underneath it, a second layer of sound formed. A low, clipped chitter that repeated in staccato syllables. The detective stopped the tape and sat forward. The sheriff's jaw worked once. "Play that from 48, the detective said. The technician rewound. They watched the waveform, the peaks and valleys of the two tracks like the topography of a strange country.
He ran it through a filter and then through a basic spectrogram. The pattern of the laugh had frequencies that matched a small human voice, but the harmonics didn't align as they should. The chitter, when isolated, looked nothing like a cough or a bird call. It had spacing, almost like a stutter turned intentional. "Could be a toy," my son heard himself say, even as his mouth tasted of metal. "A recorder someone left." "Not at that fidelity," the tech replied. "Not that low end. Whoever, whatever did that had range and control. See here, the formants don't line up with a child's vocal tract. Whoever produced this knows enough to mask true source frequencies." An officer who'd been typing notes said, "Make a note, unknown vocalization, possible mimicry, recommend no public release." They made that last part louder than it needed to be. The sheriff nodded, not because he wanted secrecy, but because he understood what secrecy sometimes keeps: mobs and pain and people trying to be brave in the wrong hour. The ledger they'd begun to keep, a plain spiral-bound notebook, received another entry that evening. My son's hand, wrote the date. His voice later read it into the sheriff's recorder. 8:12, Cámara 3, 23:41 a 23:43. Sujeto pausado en la cerca. Audio, imitación de risa, la de bajo chija. Térmico, aupilado elongado. Gait inconsistente con especies conocidas. Recomendación, evitar confrontación. Mantener perímetro, incrementar luminosidad y cámaras. Notificar a residencias cercanas. No realizar al público. "Why do you keep writing 'avoid confrontation'?" I asked later. "Because I needed the ledger to be more than a document. I needed it to be a doctrine." The sheriff promised the school principal he'd send a short note to parents. "Be vigilant. Report anything. Do not encourage children to search." The investigators who saw the tape in the evidence room did a thing I've watched police and scientists do. They argued gently about what the footage could say and what it could not. The detective wanted to keep a perimeter watch and expand to adjacent properties. The tech wanted to liaise with the state lab and, if possible, a private acoustic analyst who could model the vocalizations. The sheriff wanted to balance the technical work with the human. "We have to live with these people," he said finally, looking at me and at my son. "We can't make heroes out of civilians. We keep them safe, we document, and we answer truthfully if we can." In the weeks that followed, the county did its quiet ministrations. A state trooper came through one afternoon, serious and kind, and asked questions about timing and about our logs. He took copies of our ledger, our prints, and the HD frames. He did not promise a quick solution. He offered instead a process: chain of custody, lab tests, controlled release if it became necessary. The detective called in a specialist from the state university to analyze the acoustic track. The specialist listened with headphones longer than any of us did, and then said flatly, "There's deliberate modulation here, and the chitter has a rhythmic structure. It's not random. Whoever, or whatever, produced this patterned its voice to play with human expectation." "I should say it sounded like a child," I told the specialist. "It designed itself to sound like one," he replied. "There's a mimicry architecture in the signal." When officers with more experience than mine had to face a file for the first time, their faces tightened in private ways. Sitting at my kitchen table a night after the meeting, the thermal frames across my laptop looked like paintings, pale cyan where a human would be, a long, darker smear where the thing had stood at the fence. I could isolate a single frame and see a suggestion of shoulders and a head, but closer inspection blurred into noise. The audio there still made me press my palms to my ears, not to mute sound, but to prove I could feel it. Our choice to keep quiet, partly out of fear and partly out of respect for the sheriff's warder, bore fruit and cost us things. It kept the county from having mobs on the tracks, but it also made us the reluctant centers of gossip. People speculated anyway. Teenagers dared one another to walk near our property line at dusk and laughed as they crossed into places where our cameras caught their faces in grain. A local blogger got wind of the prints through a friend and wrote a piece that threaded fact, rumor, and poetic license. Someone called us asking to use the footage, promising that this could be big. We said no. There was a study, too, of the way fear rearranges domestic life.
We sat in that same room that swallowed light, and they played the follow-up clip. This time, the image paused at the fence for longer, and the voice, if it was a voice, practiced a pattern of syllables like a person rehearsing a line. Then, partway into the minute, a sound that was neither laugh nor chitter breathed through the recording. A phrase that bent syllables just enough to name my son's given name as if trying it on. The room went so quiet I could hear the heater click. The detective scrubbed back the waveform and zoomed in. He showed us a spectral band where the nominal childlike frequencies overlapped with an underlayer we had not noticed before. Pulses that fell below the range of casual radio play. Pulses that seemed to have intentional timing. This isn't mimicry alone, he said. This is patterning designed to test response. After that, the ledger grew a new entry. We started adding not just observations, but small experiments. Time of night, wind direction, whether we had music playing, whether lights were down. We were trying, in small ways that felt like schoolyard science, to map the variables that attracted attention. We did so out of necessity, and with the kind of logical cruelty that fear sometimes forces upon you, to make the unknown legible so you can put it in a box and lock it. But documentation is a poor substitute for sleep. The nights folded into a sequence of partial awakenings, of listening to the dog and the house settle. My son's face at the kitchen table became a map of small decisions. Who checked which camera that night? Who drove to the end of the road to sweep the embankment with a high beam? Who stayed on the porch with the children until they slept? I found myself cataloging ordinary comforts like contraband, a neighbor's porch swing, a particular angle of the streetlight. They felt like things you could hand to someone later to prove you had tried. And still, there were frames on the hard drive that made even the officer's eyes go tight. The technician would bring them up now and then, not to frighten us, but because evidence has a bluntness the rest of life lacks. He would fast forward and pause, place a ruler or a scale, measure an angle, and we watched the shadow move and interpreted the physics of what we saw. That evidence, thermal spikes, prints, vocal anomalies, wasn't a storybook. It was a ledger of small facts that added up to a strange insistence. It wasn't proof in the sense of finality. It was proof in the sense of pressure. Something wanted to be noticed. We kept our heads down. We lived to tell. The ledger kept growing in the margins, dates, times, the slow annotations of people doing their jobs. We cooperated with the county. We obeyed the sheriff's cautions. We refused the offers of cameras and microphones from people who traded sensation for attention. We learned how to say no to the spectacle, and in saying no, we protected something stubbornly mundane, a child's right to sleep through the night without being called by a voice that pretends to be them. Still, there was a sequence on the August footage that the detective insisted we re-examine with the state acoustic team.
The tech said it again in the low, technical voice he used when he wanted us to understand that this was not merely another nighttime curiosity. This frame set shows the first clear example of layered modulation. If this is what we think, it will change the advisory to active containment. We didn't yet know how active containment would look. The county had no protocols for things that mimicked children to draw you into the dark. So we sat and waited for science to speak, and for the sheriff to make choices about who to tell and what to withhold. In the house, my granddaughter began to draw maps of the yard in colored pencil, and each map had a line where she would not go. She called it her safety border, and explained it with the solemnity of someone who had been deputized in a family emergency. On a Sunday a month after the August recording, while the house smelled of coffee and paperbacks, the detective called and asked if we could come in after lunch. He had a new printout, this one from the lab, a cleaned audio spectrogram with notes scribbled along the margins, and a small typed line at the bottom that read, "Recommend continued non-engagement and controlled monitoring." He wouldn't read us more than that over the phone. There was some agreement, some slow movement toward understanding. There was, too, still so much that all the machines and the men could not fold into sense. We went because you go where the documents are stacked and the truths are measured. We went because the ledger had moved from being a book we carried like an amulet to being the only script we had to show anyone who asked how we had tried to be careful. We went because living with a thing is easier when you can hand its traces to someone with jurisdiction and say, "See, we tried to be reasonable." After that meeting, we returned home with the same new sense that the story had not finished with us. The detective's parting words were a kind of litany. No release, no baiting, increase lighting, keep records. If you hear it call a name, do not answer. We will escalate lab work. I read the last of those lines on the drive back, and for the first time felt the ledger moving like a living thing under my hand. It had become not just a record, but a rule book. We followed it because we had to, because the alternative was to trust the offended guts of a man who wanted to chase a scream at midnight and who might never come home. That night, after the children were asleep and the dog lay a long, heavy thing by the back door, I took the hard drive from the drawer where we kept it like a relic.
Eu coei os frames novamente e deixei o som play into a hush of the house. There is a kind of reckless curiosity that asks to know everything at once. There is a different, quieter kind that studies evidence and then closes the book. I tried, as best I could, to be the quieter sort. The footage showed what it had shown before. A pause at the fence, a layered vocalization, a thermal blip that did not fit the profile of neighbor wildlife. At 00114, the figure shifted and the camera's close-up, which we had installed to catch face-level details, caught a line where a face might have been if faces were meant to be seen. It was not a face as a photograph would understand, but an arrangement of light and shadow that suggested angles and absences. The sound that came then was not a child or a chitter or a laugh. It was almost a name. It was a cadence testing a pattern. I hit pause, and the domestic quiet of the house rose up like breath. For a long while I held the pause and listened to the static in the speakers. Then, softly, from the yard outside the kitchen window, a stepped sound, a thin scrape along gravel. The dog lifted his head in sleep, blinked, and then went back to sleep. My granddaughter shifted in her bed, and then the house settled. I thought of the ledger in the drawer, and the sheriff's calm voice, and the officer's polite admonitions. We did not answer that night. We kept the lights on and the cameras rolling and our hands where we could find them. The next morning, the technician called and asked to pick up a copy of the new clip. The detective wanted another review. The ledger had another space to fill. We had at this point cultivated a kind of practiced caution that turned ordinary nights into exercises in restraint. But prudence does not blunt the edges of wonder. It does not make the world less strange. It merely teaches you to catalog that strangeness in a way that might someday lead to a better question. There is more of that questioning left to tell. The state lab would call with a matrix of frequency bands. The county would wrestle with whether to put out a public advisory. People would keep talking on porches and in grocery aisles. I would keep watching footage, and the ledger would slowly thicken into something that looked for all the world like a manual. Not a final answer, but a set of measures that promised, if you followed them, a chance to remain. That afternoon, as I sat with the ledger open and a pen in my hand, a sound came through the screen of the hard drive that made the technician halfway across the county go white. He sent the clip up to the university with instructions: do not release. The words he used were dull and technical, but the implication was not. The thing had learned nuance. It had been practicing on our world. We breathed around that knowledge the way you might breathe around a sleeping animal. Lightly, with a hand poised to protect but not to provoke.